Awesome. Welcome all of any new faces to Kubernetes SIG Usability. Just to kick things off, it looks like we have a few agenda items, user research proposal, best practices presentation on Kubernetes, and a few introductions. Would anybody like to kick off introductions? Any new faces?
I can kick it off. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. I'm Carl Pearson. I'm a user researcher at Red Hat, working on OpenShift pretty much entirely. I have a background in psychology, but I've been doing UX research stuff for like 3 or 4 years now. And my general skill set is pretty mixed methods, but I try to gravitate towards the quant and data visualization stuff when there's a need there, just because I think it's fun to do stuff in R all day. So I'll be lending wherever is useful, but particularly there if I can swing it. And yeah, I had some other stuff in there that maybe I'll leave towards the end. I'm just kind of curious to hear where things are at, since I'm just sort of coming into this new and see what plans are already in store.
Awesome. Thanks.
Cool. I'm Chris. I work at Apple. Just kind of sitting in on this, seeing what's going on in this SIG. I frequent some of the other ones around, and typically have been working with some of like KubeBuilder projects and controller runtime recently. So.
Awesome. Thanks for joining.
I'm SJ. I actually work with Carl at Red Hat as a researcher. My day job is usually more on the developer side of things, but I'm helping him out with some OpenShift things. So we kind of tend to travel in packs.
Cool. Thanks for joining today. Awesome. I'll go ahead and give thanks to all that introduced themselves. I'll go ahead and give a status update on the survey. So let me pull that up real quick. Incidentally, survey was on hold for a few weeks because I was out for weddings. So thanks for bearing with me while I catch up on stuff. So for those of you that are joining in remotely or after the meeting, this is our jobs to be done proposal that we have going on right now. This is the full-fledged proposal, and there's a scaled down version of it meant to tackle phase one. Phase one, we have an initial survey drafted out in SurveyMonkey. Basic idea of the survey being that we would like to start gathering some initial data on jobs, mostly qualitative data, just to figure out kind of like what people are trying to achieve by using Kubernetes. And so in previous, in the meeting before I went out for wedding, pretty much just went through the survey and the feedback that people had given. So here we have some basic profiling criteria to get to know a little bit about the user taking the survey, kind of like their involvement with development and ops type activities, as well as a little bit about their environment. But then the main crux of the survey is a little bit of baselining, but also just what are they trying to achieve with Kubernetes itself, and what are the steps that they've taken thus far to reach it, with a space here for a way for us to reach out to them so that we can kind of follow up with them about their responses, and also be able to build out our user base with people that have volunteered to speak to us, to kind of volunteer some of their time and responses to the open source project. So I've sent out an email update, kind of just saying that here are the things that are left to be able to launch the survey, and piloting it with relevant users that would be able to just do a quick scan and see if the questions make sense, if there's no weirdness going on. And so I know that that's in flight right now. And so as soon as that is done, and if we need to incorporate any feedback, basically the survey would be ready for launching. And in the last couple of weeks, I know Tasha and Valerie as well in the past had asked about just what are the steps to use the CNCF SurveyMonkey account to be able to share our survey through there. And so I think that basically what was decided there was that the survey being in my personal account would just be transferred over to the CNCF survey, and then they would launch it. So for piloting, we're doing the piloting just with the survey in the personal account. So that's the status update there. So hopefully we'll be set up to launch it pretty soon, just as soon as the piloting feedback comes back.
Do you have a particular timeline for that?
For the piloting?
Yeah.
Hopefully within the next couple of weeks. I know there were some people on the call that had mentioned being able to help out with piloting. Would anybody like to chip in?
Yeah, I'd gladly help.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be amazing. If we could do piloting within this week or the next couple of weeks, that would be great. Yeah, thanks so much. Cool. Stop sharing. So to move on to the next item on the agenda, Jim, I think you had added an item.
Yes, I did. So apologies for being late. Hi, everyone. This is Jim Bagwadia. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Nirmata. And what I wanted to present here was Kyverno, which is a policy management framework that we've been working on. And I know I've worked with Tasha also in the multi-tenancy group, so I heard a little bit about what's going, what you folks are working on in the usability SIG, and it seemed relevant. So just wanted to briefly introduce Kyverno and see if there's a potential for collaboration as part of your efforts as well. So just in terms of timing and logistics, how much time should we plan for this part of the session?
We have until about 11:40, so
Okay.
anything between 10 and 15 minutes just to give time for the additional agenda items.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. So let me share my screen and I'll pull up a quick slide deck just to go through, and then I also want to show a quick demo. And let me know, and just feel free to interrupt. Let me know if this is relevant, not relevant, etc. And where we should focus, and certainly we can set up more time for a deeper dive if this is of interest. So policy management, of course, is part of the overall configuration management aspect in Kubernetes, and that remains, like, as we talk to customers and users, of course, that remains one of the pain points, right? Kubernetes, as a lot of you will know, is it's not secure out of the box. There's a lot of configuration complexity. And we believe that one way to address this is through policies that ops can set up and provide self-service for developers within enterprises, within organizations, right? And the reason why we built Kyverno and what what the goals here are really to provide a policy management framework which is very Kubernetes native. So there are, of course, solutions like Open Policy Agent, which are more general purpose policy management solutions, which come with a learning curve, right, and some complexity. And as we spoke to Kubernetes administrators, what we quickly learned is, it's the cost of learning, or the complexity of learning a new policy language. The bar was just too high for adoption, even though the value was fairly clear to most folks. So the motivation for Kyverno was to build something which is very much Kubernetes native, is very familiar to Kubernetes users, and adopts the best practices, patterns, idioms within Kubernetes, right? And we'll go through a few examples of these. So the goals, just making policies easier. Anybody who's familiar with Kubernetes constructs should be able to write Kyverno policies was one of the goals. And also in terms of being able to view results, being able to, also understand how to act on results is as important. So making sure that those results were very easy to find and react to. And then to be able to have a lot of flexibility in how configurations are managed, right? So everything from auditing and just reporting violations to enforcing certain policies, to be able to mutate configurations and even generate new configurations is what Kyverno does. Another important thing, and at that time as we had looked at some of the other solutions, we wanted to make sure that as more and more custom resources are becoming part of Kubernetes and part of the community, that the framework supported this natively, right? There was no limitations on which resource types could be handled, no additional libraries or anything which would have to be built to do that. And then again, like adopt things like everything from labels and selectors to annotations to events to owner references, looking at patterns like controllers, all of that. Kyverno, again, because it's designed for Kubernetes, can natively adopts and understands and makes use of as constructs. So here's just a kind of quick view of how it works. Like as you can imagine, as with any other policy management type of tool, it acts as an admission controller. So it self-registers using to receive webhook events on every API server call, and it will handle both the validate and mutate webhooks. And then as policies are defined, policies are first-class resources. You can have policies to validate, mutate, generate configurations. And we'll take a quick look at some examples. And then the output of this is, of course, there's the admission response, which goes back to the API server, or a reject or a block response if something is not allowed or does not comply with the policies. And then other outputs could be events which are generated on the resource itself, on the policy. There's policy violations, which is a custom resource. And we are working with the policy working group to make this a common resource which various policy management tools can share. So independently of how policy violations are detected, have one common way of reporting and managing them. And then, of course, if you're generating more resources, those would be generated as well. It's a quick view of how a Kyverno policy is laid out. So a policy comprises of multiple rules. Each rule can match or exclude based on kinds, on names, on label selectors, namespaces, user information, including roles, groups, names. So lots of interesting things that can be done there. And then as each rule is processed, there is a context that's built up, which includes the admission request and some additional metadata. And then the rules are evaluated in order. So you have mutate, validate, generate rules, which can apply to resources. Here's an example of what this actually looks like. And as you can see, I mean, it's pretty similar to what you would expect. Well, this block is just selecting a resource. So you can see some match labels, you can have match expressions in your selector. You can have a list of kinds for which types of resources, or use wildcards there. And once that policy is matched, the rules within that policy would be applied or evaluated on the incoming resource itself. So here's an example, and these are just fragments. I'll show like a full example too. So here's an example of what, if you're mutating a resource, you can either use a JSON patch type syntax, which is fairly precise, but requires some knowledge of the path, etc. Or you can use an overlay type syntax, which is similar to what Customize uses. It's a fragment of a YAML, which is overlaid on top of the target resource. And within overlays, there's a possibility to do some conditional logic. As you can see, like with some of these, what we call anchors, where for example, if you put parentheses around the tag, it starts meaning it's a if then else type of condition. And or you could say if something's not defined, if a port is not specified, then replace the value with 6443. But if there is a value specified, then it's untouched, and it's whatever the user has configured. So it's a fairly simple. We've tried to, you know, keep this with as minimal decoration or sort of additional syntax as required. But of course, there is a need to do some conditional logic, which is where we have introduced these type of either anchors on tags or operators and things to that nature. So another example of how you can do some variable logic here. So in this case, it's if you want to check if so if you want to enforce that labels have to be a specific label, in this example, app has to be defined in the incoming resource. It's pretty straightforward. We're using the question mark to say there at least has to be a single, one character, and start to indicate that there could be multiple. So as long as there's something defined in that app field and it's not null or an empty string, it will pass this validation rule. Otherwise, you could either block the resource from being created or just create a policy violation, which the resource owner can view. So generate is also pretty straightforward, and there's two ways to generate. Either you can, inline the data itself that you want to generate, or you can clone from existing resources. And the trigger for generate is the creation of some resource, right? And we are looking for use cases for other triggers, but what this does, for example, when a namespace is created, you can easily now generate a bunch of default configurations like quotas, like network policies, things like that, to again provide that self-service DevOps model where an operator, an admin can set up these policies, but then as users come in, create namespaces, they're secure by default, properly segmented, and configured based on what's required. So there's several other features in a demo, but let me pause here and see what the feedback and thoughts are, and happy to use the rest of the time as needed.
I'm curious how you found the adoption of the default network policy model. That's something that we were looking at adding, but generalized feedback within the contributor community was friction would be too high for users to have that behavior of flipping on a namespace that suddenly doesn't work as they expect.
Right. Yeah, so that's a very interesting point, right? And we're still, I think there is, of course, from a operator and admin perspective, having this to be secure by default and not allowing any ingress or egress traffic, but then allowing either the developer or whoever's using the namespace to add rules as required is desirable, right? The challenge that we've seen is because sometimes it's not very obvious whether even network policies are supported within a cluster, or just making sure that again the right CNI is running and properly configured, and the complexity of adding network policies sometimes tends to be the barrier. But overall, and this was at the last at KubeCon in I guess this was the US KubeCon in November. There was a session in the multi-tenancy SIG where I think it was HDFC Bank, which was presenting, and they were discussing this very same topic. And they said there was a little bit of grumbling in the beginning, but once folks understood how to configure, and once they had some network policy templates, it became pretty straightforward, and their users just got used to that, where they would get a namespace with no traffic allowed by default, but then they would add rules for ingress or egress as required.
Hey Jim, I'm wondering, just like if you have been able to gather any kind of feedback on just for the people that are using and like the features that you mentioned and how that's fitting into their workflow.
Right. So it's still, the community and with Kyverno, and we're slowly growing, and the feedback so far has been, fairly positive. And the common theme we see is that the learning curve for OPA and Rego, which is the policy language, is pretty high. Where and Kyverno seems to address that fairly well for specific use cases, right? It's not intended to be a general purpose policy tool. The workflow that you're asking about, that's very interesting, and that's something we're trying to. Uh, we believe, firmly that the right way here is to somehow enable self-service DevOps, right? Where and this is not a problem that just Kyverno by itself can solve, but there needs to be, and part of the work that's being done also in the multi-tenancy SIG working group is to allow other controllers and things like that, which can allow self-service namespaces. And then where Kyverno can help is potentially like configuring the requirements for the namespaces, or even a group of namespaces. And this would be in conjunction with other projects like the HNC, which is the hierarchical network controller, namespace controller, which will copy and manage configurations across namespaces. So with conjunction of working with these other controllers and tools, the intent is, and we're not fully there yet, but the intent is to allow operators to set up these policies. And once they set these up, the users of the cluster would then be able to come in and request or have one or more namespaces, and everything from role bindings to quotas to network policies, which we were discussing, as well as any other security policies. Like one of the things I can quickly show is like some of the best practice policies we've built with Kyverno, which cover a lot of what PSPs cover, but PSPs, of course, are fairly difficult to configure and manage at scale. And also, there's a limitation with you can't configure PSPs if you're running on a on a managed Kubernetes service like EKS, AKS. So to avoid those issues, I think that's where folks are seeing the benefits of using something like Kyverno.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me actually quickly show some of these best practice policies, and maybe just easier if I go to the repo.
Okay, and just a quick time check. Just because we're on a different version of Zoom, we may be reaching our time limit
Okay.
here. So I just want to make sure that we have time for some wrap-up conversation.
Absolutely. So I'll wrap up in 2 minutes. So just to kind of showcase, what again, just a simple policy where if you want to disallow root users, what this would look like. It's again very straightforward and familiar to somebody who's kind of seen a pod YAML or a deployment YAML. Several other features we support. One thing to highlight here is this policy is written at a pod level, but Kyverno can automatically generate rules for any pod controller. So that was another feedback item we received, which is pretty interesting, right? Because if you ideally you want to write policies which apply to all pods, but then users typically will control their pods or manage their pods to something like a deployment or a stateful set. So you want to report errors at that level, right? So how do you achieve both, where you're writing policies which apply to any pod regardless of how it was created, but then you're reporting errors at the pod controller level. So we tried a few design options, but what we settled on, which works pretty well, is at least we think so, is where you can now, when you write a policy at a pod, Kyverno can, through annotations, this can be controlled. But by default, it will generate rules for pod controllers like deployment, stateful sets, jobs, cron jobs. And then if a user, creates one of those like a deployment, which violates the pod policy, so the pod template part will be pretty much flagged, and they will be blocked to create that deployment itself. If that feature did not exist, what the behavior would be, the deployment would be accepted by the API server, but then the pod would not get scheduled because the pod creation would get blocked, right? So it's those kind of usability issues that we kind of have thought about. And because we're Kubernetes native, we can leverage existing patterns like the relationship between controllers and pods. Anyways, let me pause there. And again, happy to set up a separate session where we could do a deep dive in a demo. I'm sharing the Git repo. There's quite a bit of documentation. It's very easy to install and kind of try Kyverno out yourself, right? If you have a cluster, either with kind or any local cluster, you can just pretty much install and run through this install.yaml and then try out some of the sample policies. So would be happy to get feedback and thoughts on next steps, but let me stop there for time.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I think just due to time, we may be able to continue a conversation in the Slack. If you want to post the links in there, I think it would be great for people to check them out.
Okay.
And ask follow-up questions.
Definitely, will do.
Thanks. Yeah, last item on the agenda. I think we actually swapped a few items, but just introductions or any follow-up questions on the Carl, I know you had filled out a slot on the agenda. Do you have any follow-up questions just on the survey or any of the work that's going on there?
Yeah, so for the survey, I guess, have people been working on like some operational stuff about like governance with this data? Like who's allowed to see the raw data, especially if we're collecting names and stuff like that? Is that all intended to be public, or like is there any sort of communication to people that are signing up for this, like how we're going to handle their data and their contact information and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say that we haven't defined that for this specific survey, but I'm curious since we are using the CNCF account, just it would be good to know just like what their if there's existing procedures in place for handling that type of data.
Yeah, I'm not familiar. So to be honest, this is the first like SIG I've joined at all. So I'm pretty unfamiliar with this space in general. I'd volunteer and I can, but I'm not sure exactly. Someone might have to point me in the right direction to like who do I contact about that or like get access to that information.
Yeah, I think for a couple of us, at least I know for me personally, it's also my first SIG and the only one that I'm involved in. So that's you're not alone there. I think Tasha has been pretty, and Valerie as well, have been pretty great about knowing who to contact and just kind of like which Slack channels to post and ask questions. So I know in specifically to find the CNCF account, she posted in the contributor experience channel.
Okay.
Just a question there. So happy to share that post with you and see if we can pick up the conversation there, because I think that those are great questions.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I can, track that channel down and find some of those answers maybe. And did you say we only had till 40 minutes for this meeting?
Yes, but I think I just got a notification 2 minutes ago that our time has been extended.
Okay,
So
cool.
I guess that's good news.
Yeah. So then the one other thing I wanted to bring up is like where this data like will live, if there's sort of, is there like a repo that's been defined for like sharing out insights and or raw data? Maybe that's something that comes when I ask the CNCF folks about storage and things like that.
We've spoken in the past about possibly using a repo to store the data, but this is actually our first research in kind of like initiative that we're doing as part of the SIG. So open to kind of like all of those details being kind of like hammered out.
Yeah, sounds good. It's an opportunity to start right when the first research is being done ever, rather than having to catch up on
that's
a
awesome.
whole wealth of research. So that's cool. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I just wanted to get a sense of where that was. I might do some thinking on that and bring some info or a doc back with some ideas, if that's where we're at.
Yeah, I know something that was mentioned previously is that because this SIG is kind of heavy on well, a lot of the projects have been user research focused. I don't know if we have as much precedence for user research in other SIGs. I know I've shared some links before of surveys that other SIGs have done, not through CNCF, but through, it might have been a different survey tool, but I know that they shared raw results, but I don't believe that they shared personal like information like names or email, just kind of like the comments and questions that were answered. So I'm also happy to share those just as kind of like precedences.
Yeah.
We'll double check the best way that PII is going to be handled and figure out easiest way to redact that. We might have to restrict some fields that are more like telling in others regarding qualitative data, but certainly the quantitative data would be easy to post.
Mm-hmm. And I like what Carl mentioned about just being a little bit more, I guess, like upfront about the information that is collected through the survey and kind of how that information would be treated. So.
Yeah, it seems like the quantitative stuff and maybe some redacted qualitative information would be easy, but yeah, maybe just thinking about establishing some kind of process for like if the intent is to follow up with these users, who gets to follow up, or like how is that person vetted, rather than just like the data governance policies. So yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, also happy to follow up on that conversation.
Cool. Sweet. Well, yeah, I just wanted to get a state of things. That's really helpful. And looking forward to digging in a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all the items on the agenda. Does anybody else have anything else? Otherwise, we can end a few minutes early. All right. Well, thanks all for joining, and see y'all at the next one and also on the Slack.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.